classification, compensation, and training. And the second forum will be next Wednesday, so if your colleagues weren't able to come, please encourage them to come to the one next Wednesday on the 21st. It will be after lunch from 1 to 2:30. And we are taping both of these forums, so they will be posted on a staff council SharePoint site, and you can refer your staff colleagues to that as well. This is really important information, and it's information that hasn't been shared with the staff before in this type of form and in this type of way. So we really wanted as many staff to come as possible, so we're thrilled that you're here. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Carol Brown, and I've been this year's Staff Council President. It's been an honor and a privilege and a lot of fun to be that person. I would like the other Staff Council members who are here to stand and kind of be recognized, if you would. I see a few of them here. So thank you. Give them a round of applause. These people serve on Staff Council. They express their interest to former council members. They talked to their supervisors. They got their supervisor and VP of their area's approval to be on council. They serve for 2 years. And this is without compensation, without any kind of special bonuses or anything. It's just out of their time and out of their service and their love for SPU that they do this. And so I just wanted you all to know that and to appreciate the fact that they put in these efforts to really hopefully improve the situation and be your voice to the administration. And I also wanted to introduce Karen Altus, who is our president-elect for next year, so if Karen would stand again. So her term will begin July 1st, and our new council members will begin then as well. And we'll have a crossover during the summer where both councils from this year and next year will be working together just to smooth the transition and bring forward issues that are important to you. I'm not showing the slideshow, but one of the slides that goes along with this slide says that if you have ideas for forums, things that you'd like to discuss openly with other staff, please contact me, contact Karen, contact your staff council member and let us know. And those could include anything from you wanting to be involved in what's going on with SPU as far as facility development or accreditation or staff development and professional evaluations or whatever it is. So let us know. I had said in December that we're here to engage you in conversation and provide opportunities that foster community and fellowship, to empower you, to provide information, and to equip you with the tools that you need to perform effectively. And of course, to recognize your service and achievements, which we'll do next week at the President's Forum. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guests today. First, we have Don Mortensen, who is the Senior Vice President for Planning and Administration. And Don will be speaking to us today about staff classification and compensation and a few other things. I think he may have some surprises. During that time, if you have, well, I don't know, maybe you won't. Maybe it'll be really dry and boring and we'll all get up and leave, but let's not do that because he may never come talk to us again. A lot of people answered, submitted their questions on the survey, and I really appreciate that because I know sometimes it's hard to stand up at a staff forum in front of directors, administrators, and presidents and ask questions that could be divisive, that could be a bit dicey if you ask. So I appreciate, and we have those questions, and we provided them to these two gentlemen. But feel free to ask questions here as well. And the other distinguished gentleman we have is Gary Wolmstuff, who is the Director of Human Resources. And he will talk about staff training and opportunities that are coming up for us, and development and perhaps some evaluation, but I don't think so much that. But so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Don and Gary.
Thank you, Carol, I think. If we're expecting a dry and boring presentation, maybe we'll walk out. Save you guys the trouble. But no, I think it's going to be a little bit more interesting than that today. We do look forward to being able to share some ideas and also answer some questions. And so I have in my hot little hand here a list of some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. No idea who from, but we're not necessarily going to get to all of them, but I think a number of them were already going to be worked into our presentation. A few of them were not necessarily, and we're going to try and get to them if we possibly can and still honor our time. And if it doesn't end up being that your question was answered, then feel free to contact me or staff counsel again afterwards and further the conversation. We recognize this is a limited forum to some degree in terms of time, but let's try and make this an honest one. So we understood that the topic was this deep, dark secret about staff salaries and compensation, or at least that's maybe how it appeared or felt to some people. This is a little tongue-in-cheek, maybe a lot tongue-in-cheek, in the sense that we don't intend for it to be a deep, dark secret. As you will see as we get into this, some of it is a little complicated, and maybe that's why it appears to be a deep, dark secret sometimes, but it's not intended to be that way. So please feel free to dive in. If you have a question as we go along, I believe a couple of staff council people, am I right, Carol, are going to have some microphones. And so rather than wait to the end and maybe you forgot what the question was, as we go along, feel free to ask a question. So raise your hand, stand up, get their attention, and we'll do our best, as well as keeping our time rolling along, to get to as many questions as we can. Here's the variety of topics we are going to try and cover today. How our salary is determined at SPU. What is your salary range? How do salary ranges work? And is that even important? What's the difference between exempt and non-exempt, and why? And is that important? And of course, what everyone wants to know is, how does one get a raise at a place like SPU? So we're going to let Dawn dive into the deep end on some of the compensation, and I'll come and talk about how Human Resources does their part of it here in just a minute.
Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Carol and the staff council for giving us this opportunity to talk about it. I'm not sure why we waited so long to do it, but we've only been doing this compensation plan for about 23 years. In terms of being dry and boring, I was at reminded me when Carol mentioned that, I was at a conference quite a few years ago now where, and this has actually happened, this is not a made-up story, the speaker we were listening to fell asleep. I'm a little fearful that's going to happen to me after 2 days of board meetings, so we'll see. The first thing I want to do is kind of talk about the compensation history. It's been around for 23 years. It really started in the 1990s, early 90s, and it started on the faculty side. Up until that time, faculty were paid, no matter what discipline they were in, based on their rank. Instructor, assistant professor, associate professor, and so on. Staff, we had our non-exempt staff tied to a state of Washington system called the HEP board, and that lived a life of its own. And then all the exempt staff were pretty much at the mercy of the area vice presidents and what they were paid. There was cool increases like we have today, but there was no systematic way of looking at salaries, particularly as it relates to market. And SPU became pretty sophisticated in the late 70s, moving into becoming university status, and with a lot of professional disciplines and other things. And so to be competitive, we said we've got to look at the market. And this was a big step forward for the faculty to actually start thinking about their salaries being on the basis of what the market is. And we came up with a concept called equitable sacrifice. So you would have, say, electrical engineers, we have a new electrical engineering program that could command substantial salaries in industry. And so higher education, to get them to teach, often had to pay them higher salaries than, say, English professors. There's now a lot of demand out in the corporate world for English professors. So we went to what is known as a differential pay system on the faculty side. And with that, we said we've got to do something on the staff side as well, because we need to stay competitive as we grow as an institution on the staff as much as we do on the faculty. And so we started the system, and from that time and even to this day, every position, each one of your positions, is coded to a particular market benchmark. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and talk about in a few cases where we can find a benchmark and how do we handle that. And at that time, we also had some other factors in there, what we call job factors and longevity factors. All that meant was, our job factor, if you had a pretty good match to a external benchmark, something out in higher ed or even local market, but your position had more responsibilities, or say a lot less responsibilities than that benchmark, we used this job factor to either adjust it up or down. And then longevity was to take into account years of service. The compensation system at its very core is really designed to attract people and to retain people over long periods of time. So we wanted to make sure that we had some type of factor in there for longevity. Then we proceeded along in the late 1990s, not the very end, I think it was around 96 or so. We started a major effort on the staff side to make sure that our classification of individual jobs was really helping out with this market analysis. Up until that point, this is not 100% true, but on a majority basis, individual supervisors and department heads and VPs determined the job, wrote up their own job descriptions, and we tried to factor it in based on a benchmark for that particular position. In the late 90s, we brought in a consultant, created a committee of staff and faculty, and we went through and we wrote up a job description for every position and tried to be on a consistent basis how we built that and defined things. And from that classification, then we re-studied each of the market benchmarks. And we've been on that system since that point in time. As part of that process, the feedback we had from the committee was, let's try to keep this as simple as possible. So we dropped the job duties adjustment and even the years of service adjustment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. As we get into the details of the comp plan, I think it's important to keep a couple things in mind. Number one, this covers every position right up to the president. So I do a study for the board, for the president and vice presidents every year, and show them the comparative market. One general rule that's true, there's probably a few exceptions here and there, but one general rule that's true is the higher you go in the organization, the more focused you are in terms of market benchmark, who we're comparing you to higher education. There are many positions that are lower that and the whole purpose of this, so when we go out to recruit for somebody in a particular position, where do we tend to recruit? What kind of salaries do we need to be at to recruit and be successful? And so for many positions lower in the organization, we also look at the local Puget Sound area. And that's a survey called the Milliman. You see it up here. Milliman looks at positions in the area that have comparable. Now we could say, well, why don't we do that for the president, for instance? Well, what do we have in the area? Well, we have presidents of some major corporations, Microsoft and others, and we don't think that's quite the way we should do it. So that's why we limited it to higher education, the higher you go up. So there's more of a limiting thing going on with the senior administrators and deans and that type of thing. We continue to use HEPBoard, and I'll say a few words about that concern in a moment, but that impacts a few of our positions. Coupa is our main benchmark. That's the higher ed industry. College University Personnel Association. And that, we get a survey, we participate in it every year. We get information, not just raw salaries, but by type of institution. We use a variety of tables that we look at. It's size of institution, our 3,000 to 5,000 size FTEs enrollment, our budget size, independent institutions, comprehensive universities. We get a number of these selects and look at. The other feature of this is a national survey. So when we talk about market, what does market mean? Market is simply defined as what are other people making in a similar position at a similar institution. That's market in our conditions. So we want to be competitive. and from that standpoint. So that's what drives this process. The final thing that we do is, since that's a national survey, is picking up people that live in a high-cost area such as San Francisco, but also folks working for Greenfield College in Illinois, and out in the farmland, so to speak, in much lower-cost areas. Seattle, we look at an index that's published every year, and Seattle is on a cost of living basis is 119% of the national average. So we have a higher cost area. I've seen it as high as 125%. That's come down here in recent years. But that's still a sizable adjustment. So we take these goal salaries, these national surveys, and we increase them by 19%. So that it's on a hopefully equivalent basis to our area. Any other questions? So here are the major, yeah.
Don, I thought the Seattle adjustment was 10%, but it's 19? Did you hear me?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yes?
It was 10% last year, 19% this year.
Okay.
And thanks for raising that. We started this process probably 6 years ago of adjusting it for the COLA, cost of living index. And to bring it in the system right away would raise everybody's goal salaries immediately and create a larger variance. And so we said, let's ratchet into it. The faculty faculty affairs just went through a study of the faculty compensation system this past year. And they made some adjustments, and they recommended we forget about just doing the partial COLA. Let's go to the actual COLA, so it can go up and down. We warned them it can go up and down every year. And so, but they elected that, and because we want a consistent pattern, we put the staff on that basis as well. So there's going to be what we thought was our variance this year of approximately 94% on average of the goal. Across staff will probably drop down because of that, but it gives us a goal. The other thing I want to say as we look at more detail in terms of perspective is 60 to 65% of our budget is compensation, salary and benefits, and support costs to staff and faculty. So every decision we make on the salary and compensation side immediately impacts tuition. So in any one year, we are balancing back and forth. How do we increase the compensation for our employees, and how do we keep costs down for the students? And that's a balancing act. In some years, we surge ahead on tuition and salaries. Other years, we have to be more careful. During the recession, for instance, in 2009-10, we decided to hold salaries at zero because we wanted to give students just a 2% increase in tuition and to try to keep people enrolled during the Great Recession. Okay, let's go through some of the major tenets of the plan. Each position is have its own benchmark and updated annually. So I'll repeat this several times, but one of the key things of the system, we're going to measure it every year. We're not going to just look at it every fifth year or something. If an external benchmark cannot be found for a position, then the average of the external markets in the same range will become the market goal for that position. Gary's going to talk a little bit more about that. In a few cases, I want to say what, 20%, 25%, maybe not that much. We can't find a good external benchmark. And so what do? That's where these ranges come in play. So if your position, job description, is classified at range, what, 37 or something, and we can't find a good match, then your goal will become the average of everybody else. You will not be hampered because you don't have good external. You'll go to the average of everybody else's external average in that group, in that range. So in some ways, it doesn't matter what your range is, as long as we have one, and sometimes those ranges change. Especially if you have a external market, if your range changes, and it can periodically, just the way things are bracketed, it has no impact on you because your salary is still tied to your original benchmark. The other thing that the tenet of the plan is we want consistency across the institution, so we put everything through HR to look at these job descriptions and do the classifications. This is not an exact science. Takes judgment and close scrutiny, but we want the same person doing it all the time, so there is some consistency across the institutions. We also try to identify all the goals that could apply, because if you get into statistics and averaging and things and seeing changes over years, it's really good to have multiple tables and to average things, because things can go jump up and down on individual positions, so the averaging works out. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the higher up you are in the organization, you are going to be pretty much at a higher ed index. As you move down, there are some technical positions, Dave's staff in CIS, we have a lot of competition, and we're trying to hire in the city where there's a lot of software and system engineer possibilities. So we're going to look at the local surveys there as well as the higher ed surveys. So we'll take all these surveys and try to average them. Now, one thing you'll hear say a number of times, that's the goal salary. Salaries are influenced by that goal salary, but they don't dictate the salary. And so the actual salary has to be finally determined by the supervisor and the VP. And there they'll be taking into account things that are not in the system right now, and I'll talk about one change we're making this year. But they need to take into account performance, years in position, the contribution to the department, things like that, when making individual salaries. We give all these salary sheets out to the VPs and supervisors every year with a formula suggested increase based on ATB, and I'll go through the detail here in a moment, ATB and variance. We still ask them to make individual judgments. Let me give you an example. If a person starts in a position that is far from his market, for whatever reason, and that's one of the weaknesses in the system I'm going to talk about, if they start at a lower percent of market, let's say they come in at their 85% of their benchmark, and we're going to give 10% that year in improvement in that variance. So that gap, that 15% gap between the average and where that salary set, they're going to get 10% of that dollar gap, just on a formula basis, plus whatever ATB we get at the same time. So if that person brand new gets that, they've got a person in the same department who's been there for, say, 10 years, they're at their goal. Let's say they're at 98% of their goal, or even 100% of their goal after the years of service. And that's a key person. We don't want to lose that person. We don't want to have the supervisor feel like they have to give just a 1%, that's the ATB for that year, a 1% to the proven winner, and it could be 11, 12% to the brand new employee. It's a judgment call. We still need good human judgment calls in making salary decisions, so that comes into play. But we said, let's put some bands on this thing. And so as long as that salary is above 80% and up to 120% of that individual's goal, they can make that judgment call. Anything below or above that has to have the president's approval. I mentioned about the annual measurement of this. This also not just helps us set individual salaries, it helps us plan the budget. We need to track this to know what kind of pool increase we make every year. I mentioned that position equity is defined as reducing variance at the same percentage rate for each staff. So what do we mean by equity in the system? We mean that if person A is at one variance, person B is at another variance, we're going to try to improve them at the same percentage rate every year. That subject to these other adjustments. And then we take the pool funding every year and we divide it out among the VP area. It's based on that total dollar. So if you're in an area that is, for some reason, well below market, you're going to get more of that share of that dollars that year to help address that. Okay, let's identify some of the weaknesses of the plan. First of all, because of, I mentioned about tuition rate and going through different economic cycles. The budget funding hasn't always been sufficient on a sustained basis, year in and year out, to really make big strides on the grants. When we started out this plan, we were about 80%, both on the faculty and staff, 80% or more. And as I mentioned earlier, this past year we came in at about 94%. So we have made progress, but one of the weaknesses of the plan is it is subject to whatever we can do on the tuition funding side. I mentioned Higher Education Personnel Board before. We like to get off of this entirely. There's a few positions left that it still makes sense to use that because there's not another benchmark. But the Higher Education Personnel Board is a state of Washington phenomenon, and it has been around forever. It's what defines the salaries at all of the state institutions. You know, University of Washington, all of the staff positions, not the faculty. Washington State, Western Washington, and so on. And that is more of it's turning out to be more of a political survey and judgment, and one impacted greatly by what's happening in the budget. We went through here a period of years, Gary, what, 4 years? 4 years where it didn't have any increase at all in the HEP board because of what's happening in the state of Washington. So we just made up our own increase to the HEP board, and we're trying to get more and more positions on Coupa. Coupa, fortunately, has been issuing more surveys at different levels within the institution, so that's helping a lot too. Another weakness is not all VPs and supervisors should do the same amount of rigor on setting salaries. You know, I've watched this for years, and I've seen it's been improving, but I've seen times where I've gotten back sheets from areas that have very few adjustments. They're just taking a formula. And that indicates to me that there's not a lot of rigor going into making individual judgment calls. So that's one thing we're working on. We're talking about that at the senior leadership team about training. It's one of the reasons I'm glad that Carol asked for this. And also, we're talking about supervisory training to really make sure our supervisors understand the system. You know, the fact that we're still on a system created in the late 90s is an indication. How many of you here have joined SBU after 2000? I mean, almost the entire room. So you weren't around when we did this, so the communication part is pretty important to get that going for the supervisors as well. One of the things I mentioned in one of my illustrations that sometimes a department will cobble together a budget to create a new position to get approval for it, and they put as much as they can together. And it turns out that when the final classification is done through HR, which Gary's going to go through in a moment, that the funding they've put together only gets it to 80% or 85% of the market instead of 94, which is the institutional average. And so a variance is created. So one of the weaknesses of the plan, which I think we need to address, is what is the minimum funding we're going to require departments to get together, put together for a new position, so we don't just immediately create a large negative variance. Now, one of the things that happens is we're simply taking survey of actual salaries. And watching this over the years, I've seen individual positions coming back from Coupa in particular. It was an average of, say, 52,000 one year, and the next year it's down to 48,000. What's going on? Well, what that tells me several things. One is there's a turnover going on in higher ed at that position, larger than in most years. So the tendency is to bring new people in, experienced people, to bring them in a lower salary. So that's part of it. The other is, over long periods of time, if that salary level stays down for that position, also means that the demand for that position is dropping. There's a higher supply than demand, and schools are not having to pay as much. So we watch that pretty closely, and we do have a system right now to protect staff in that if individuals' comparison outside benchmark drops, we do not let that benchmark drop for that staff member the next year. If it stays down multiple years, yes, eventually that benchmark will come down.
Quick question, if you could go back to the last slide, and I have a feeling you'll address this, but point number 3, when you talk about VPs and supervisors are not equally rigorous, if you will address this later on, that would be fine as well. How can us as staff members assist in the process of helping our supervisors be more rigorous in ensuring our salaries are adjusted accordingly based on our training that we received, the merit of our outstanding work and that type of thing? So what role can we play in that? How can we
Well, the
help that process along?
age-old problem for anybody that has a supervisor is how do you fire the boss? And only faculty to figure that one out. It's a good question. I mean, you've got to ask. You've got to be asking the right questions. You know, one of the things that is in the letter, you may have seen every year that was sent out by the president, is if you got questions, go to your supervisor and ask. So one of the things you're going to see this year, for the first time, is we're going to, it's a big system issue to figure out in terms of embedding it into individual letters. But we're going to try to show in the letter everybody's percent of goal, where they are as a percent of their mark. Hopefully that will prompt some of that discussion. Gary's going to get into, on the other side here, a very meaningful ways to look at the job description itself and the classifications, make sure it's properly classified.
So, Don, I just want to clarify again on point 3 that the actual goal salary is the average of like positions at other similar institutions, correct?
Right.
So therefore, it seems to make sense that the bounds are
It's the average of the meetings, yeah.
yeah, the average of the meetings, exactly. So the midpoint is the goal.
Yeah.
Speaking in layman's terms. So it makes sense then that the bounds are 80% and 120%, right, to have some variability there. But I guess what I'm wondering is, I haven't seen, what I've consistently seen, and as you know, I've been here since nearly the beginning of time, almost like you, that 100% has been the goal, and like hasn't been much flexibility to move beyond that for the good long-term staff that was on bullet number 3. Well, can you speak, I mean, is that a change that's coming, or how do you see that?
It is a change, you know, I'll address that in a moment.
Oh,
But you're right. It's been up to the VP and the supervisor to take into account those other things. And that's why we gave the range, but it was individualized at the department level, at the VP level, where that happened. Now, this may sound funny, and I've told this to our faculty colleagues a lot. They say, well, we never get the goal. And I'm saying, you don't want to get the goal. If you're thinking in terms of salary increases, you want the market to keep going up, because then that variance is always going to be there, and you're going to get a percentage of that variance. If you get the goal, you know, the temptation was, well, we don't need it anymore. We're at the market. Why should we do it anymore? So be careful what you wish for at some of those issues. But that's why we track it. That's why I said we were at 94 now, we're at 80. We need to move there on average. We're not going to get every position there at 100% because of the turnover and other things, but that's generally we want to, in terms, again, our ultimate goal is good recruitment and good retention.
So in some cases, we would have the flexibility to go above the goal.
Oh yeah, you'll see a chart, I think it's still in your presentation, that shows the distribution of where we are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go on. One question from that mentioned not wanting to get to the goal, but if the market continues to increase, wouldn't the goal continue to increase? So that would give us opportunities to continue to want to reach the goal and work towards that?
I would track the tables themselves, and I would say they typically, the overall positions we're comparing to are going up 3 to 5% a year, depending on the year. I mean, during the recession, the tables coming back from other institutions were very low. They weren't going up much. So we were all in the same boat. But I've seen surveys year to year that come back, a couple of positions are going up 10 or 11%. That tells me that there's the turnover, it's hard to recruit. There are certain areas, technical areas in particular, that tend to be the leaders in increases just because the supply of people with technical skills is low. Okay? So what are the strengths of the plan? The annual measurement, perform management and budget, national surveys, the 19% increase that recognize our higher cost of living. We have an equitable approach to reducing variances. We have an equitable approach to allocating funds to each VP area. The discretion, you know, on one hand it's a weakness, but on the other hand it's a big strength of the plan is that we let decisions be localized with supervisors and the VP. We don't mandate anything from the top. Obviously they need to stay within their budget envelope so they don't have ultimate discretion to do whatever they want. I've had years where I've had supervisors in my area recommend salary increases that were beyond the budget, and they provided budget reductions from some other operating area to cover the cost. There's a good, I think, a very healthy and good, consistent approach to classifying positions through HR right now. And then, starting this next year, which is Jackie's question, we're going to start adjusting those goals for years of service. We've done a study of the Coupa tables, and this next slide shows you what the SLT has approved. So, this is years in the position, not years at SBU, years in the position. So, in Rough Cut, we've got a general rule we can get into if we have interest in it, but the first 3 years in that position will take 95% of the goal. That's your external as your goal. When you get to 4 through 9, we'll take 100%. 10 to 14, 105%. So you've been here 10 years, and you were at 100% of that goal. The next year, you're going to be at 105. Your goal is going to be 105% of the new market average. And then 15 years, you're going to top out at 110%, but we don't think that's a problem. Now, this 4 through 9 range is statistically just taking the survey here. We got, Cherry did a special run on our Coupa tables, and the years in the position by the reporting schools showed that 4 through 9 was the national average plus or minus the standard deviation. In other words, 68% of the respondents on the survey were in the 4 through 9. So we said that's the 100% target for us, and up and down from there. So that's going to, when the supervisors and VPs get their sheets this year, they're going to have calculations for each individual based on a goal adjusted by the 19% and by this. Is that clear? So here's the detail. This is what supervisors look at in much more sophisticated detail than this one, but you can kind of see it. So right across, here's a group of positions. Now this is artificial in that you're not going to have quite that variety of classification rates. So E is exempt staff, N is non-exempt, and then ranges within that. And then IS is information systems workers or service workers. Then we have the budget line. How much is in the line? Then we have the actual salary. Then we have this actual benchmark that comes over from the tables that we've been averaging, adjusted by that 19%, adjusted by the years of service. And then we're going to calculate the variance. In some positions you can see, again, this is just an illustration, most of them are in the black, meaning there's a negative variance. They're short from goal. The ones in red are the ones that are above goal. And this is roughly indicative of where we are. In other words, this about 3 positions are over for, every 15 or so that are up. So we then calculate the percent of goal, which is just the division. And then, okay, so how do we create the formula that we send out to the VPs? I've been using the term ATB here. What that means in our jargon is across the board. That's our attempt to recognize cost of living generally in the area. And we track in our budget process the Seattle CPI, and they change every year. And that's our beginning point. But we don't take the full Seattle CPI because not all components of individuals' costs go up the way that the Seattle CPI goes up. So we usually take about 75% of the Seattle CPI. That governs the ATB. So in this particular example, this year, I've used 1.5. This year, because our CPI was so low in Seattle, the ATB is going to be 1% for everybody. Now, the exceptions to that ATB would be someone who's just starting a new position June 1, for instance. We're not going to turn around in July 1 and give them a 1% increase, but that would be, so there are very rare exceptions to this ATB. Then we have the variance. This is what's moving us towards market. And here's the equitable approach to this thing. We're saying everybody's variance is going to be moved at 15%. So the one that's at, say, take the example of the 86% person right there, when I moved it, sorry. So you take this 86%. That means they're farther away from their goal. They're going to get 15% of that variance, or $1,740. They're going to get an ATB of $1,100. Their year-to-year increase is 3.87. Someone who is at goal, they're going to get 786 on a formula basis. Now, again, I shouldn't use the word they're going to get. That's what the formula says. It's up to the VP and supervisor to adjust them within that group. If this is a person that is not doing as well, they may decide that's sufficient. They're not doing as well that year in their performance. Or they think that this is a key person staff, they're a winner for us, I can't let that happen, they may give a slightly higher. Any questions? This is where the rubber meets the road in this kind of.
Is that the last three columns? Oh, I'm sorry. The last three columns there, are they shown to supervisors?
Yep.
So the percent of funded
Yeah.
and the ATM? Oh.
Now, they're shown to the VPs.
Ah.
Each VP has their own way of doing it. I don't know, again, I think most just take the sheets that they get and distribute them among the departments.
Okay, so it's in those big sheets?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay? Sure enough.
How much time are you giving supervisors to consider the variances and adjustments?
What's our turnaround?
Depends on the year, 2 to 3 weeks.
For all their staff?
Yeah.
How many staff are there? Like 600?
Well, there's probably total staff, the head count is probably 500 something. But on an FTE basis, it's about 383, so, a lot of part-time, somewhere in that range.
I'm sorry if I missed this. Is the percent of variance funded always 15% every year?
No, depending on what the pool is. It typically is in the range of 10 to 18%, except for the year we had a 0% pool. Okay, so,
One more question.
yeah.
I don't know if this is true. I heard that you said salary is 60% of the SPU budget.
Yeah,
Per year.
well, it's salary and benefits.
Yeah, okay. And that 94% of SPU's budget is from tuition? Is that right?
No, probably 70, well, let's think about student fees, so it includes room and board. So you're probably around 75% of the revenues come from students.
Okay, that was in the group thing. That is obviously an incorrect statistic. I thought 94 was crazy high.
Yeah, 94% is the number that happened. That's just by coincidence where we are this past year is percent of goal on average for staff.
Oh, okay, that must be where I
Yeah.
got that. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Now, the students are critical to our budget.
Yes, they are.
We're all into retention mode, the students, right? Okay, any other questions? Okay, so this is a detail, it's not impacting too many people, but this is just how the worksheet approach that we go through when an individual does not have a good external benchmark. So we take it at the average. So here's a situation where everybody in EO2's market is listed there. And this is the actual. I obviously haven't listed the names of the positions, but this is the market for EO2 this last year. And the average is right there. That's the goal, market goal for anybody in EO2 that doesn't have an external benchmark. Okay. So I'm going to end here, and I can turn it over to Gary just quickly on how staff get a raise. I mentioned from the annual budget salary pool increase, you get an ATB, all but a few staff, percent of variance from market adjusted by supervisor and area VP, and often VPs and supervisors take the time at that time, because they've gone through a new classification review of a job description and do promotions for particular staff, and that's often effective July 1. Not always, but more often than not. Then outside of the major budget cycles, added responsibilities can occur throughout the year, and supervisor working with their area VP through reserves or making budget reductions can promote individuals in after a new classification study. Occasionally, very infrequently, we've had to respond to key positions that were being recruited away from SPU that we felt it was not wise to let that person go, and VP has come together with funding and made a proposal to the president to increase the salary. But that, I could probably count that happening in 2 hands in my 30 years. So, and then you can certainly, the staff can apply for and move to another position in the institution that's higher pay. So those are the basic ways of doing it. And the first starting point for those of you who've been here for a while, it's a question in your mind, is look at your job description. Talk to your supervisor about your job description. Make sure that job description is up to date. If your duties have changed, expanded, or whatever, that's the time to talk to HR.
That was the comment I was just going to make, is that in our department recently, we had program coordinators who are staff members that have been here quite a while, and they have changed their job description over all the years they've been here, and they submitted their new job descriptions to HR, and they were reclassed. So that's a valuable tool for staff to be aware of, that if you've been here a long, long time and your job is basically something different than what you were doing before, make your supervisor aware. He probably, or she is probably already aware of that, and see if that makes a difference in where you're classified. So it's important information. This is great. Thank you, Don.
Dave, you've done this for so many years in CIS, and Dave and I have worked a long time together. And he's one of the, I would say, top managers in the area in terms of working with his staff and salaries. Any particular words of wisdom in terms of when you're working with your staff?
I think the overall strategy works well for probably 80 to 85% of the group. There's always a few outliers, and I think our attempt is to not necessarily try to assume that everybody can always be treated equally, but everybody needs to be treated fairly. And so there are particular positions that we target every year and say we really need to do something specifically for that particular position. When you have 25 positions to deal with, there's a little more flexibility, and that's a luxury we have. But overall, I think it actually works pretty effectively.
Hey, Gary?
Okay, what I'd like to do is switch gears just a little bit and take it from the 60,000 foot view down to more personal view. If I can figure out how to make this thing go forward. I'll tell you how it really works. Or so it seems sometimes. Carol, I think this is maybe what you were asking. And so I'd like to read one of the questions that came in. The staff council gave opportunities for people to submit questions in advance. So here's, Carol, maybe you put this one in. It says, is there a time when so many duties as assigned have been added to a person's job over 15 plus years that it would fall into a different classification or compensation? And or doubling of your job duties. And so I think it's a fair question, and perhaps for some people it actually sort of feels like that way after a period. So let's talk a little bit about where do we start on that individual basis. And Don's mentioned this, and I just want to reiterate this. It really does start with an accurate job description, particularly if you have been here for a while. And I still run across these because we actually track them in HR by date. We have some job descriptions that have not changed since 1998. Actually, probably longer than that, but that's when they put a date on it. And so whenever we see that, I try and be proactive and go back to that supervisor and say, no, wait a minute, this can't be right. I mean, that's a long time. This job must have changed some. More likely it's because you guys are noticing, or your supervisor's noticing during this annual process and saying, we need to make some changes. But that is exactly where it starts. And there's a lot of reasons to have an accurate job description. I list a few of them here. You know, if you're someone's leaving and you're now hiring a new person, in some departments that happens a lot. You got to know who to hire based on what your job is. And the person needs to know that they're entering into a job that they can do. So obviously right from the beginning, an accurate job description is really important. And for setting the right salary, which is our whole discussion today. And part of that discussion will be the third point, accurately classifying between exempt and non-exempt. That's based on job duties, not based on job titles. And then obviously for future performance evaluation, which is another topic for another day, but it's something that's on our radar to do a better job across campus. What should you be evaluated on, but what you were hired to do. What is expected of you should be accurate in your job description. So for a lot of reasons, there should be accurate and regular evaluation of what is on your job description. And if you're one of those people who are maybe not so sure, ask for a copy of your job description. If you're a supervisor, you ought to be able to have a good conversation. Ask good questions, make them polite, but feel free to engage that conversation with your supervisor. I sense a question coming on.
I'm just wondering if it might be possible to sometime have a supervisor's workshop for how to write job descriptions, because I never know like how much detail to drill down on, or it just seems like it's sort of specific language. Like there's specific language around resumes, for example, and we all in our shop have learned how to do that. But it feels like there's specific language around job descriptions, and I always feel kind of at a loss. So I would appreciate if there would be some kind of training on that, or I don't know, maybe a template? What? I do not believe that.
Actually, good point. Supervisor training is something we do want to improve, and that would be a good topic to have, because sometimes things are fairly boilerplate and obvious, and you can get something from a peer, and it's, that's right on. Other times there's a lot of creativity that needs to take place in your department to come up with what is it you're actually trying to do. And that's going to come best from you, not from HR, but we can certainly help maybe guide or bring in some resources. So that job description is a place we start. And there's a couple things that I mentioned we're going to be looking at. One is this question of exempt or non-exempt, and the other is setting an accurate and appropriate salary. So first of all, let's look at, first of all, we're trying not to just throw darts. You can see from Don's charts that this is a fairly involved process. It's not just throw darts at the wall and guess. And maybe some of you come from other companies where it is a little bit less formal than we have here. And it does seem like this, but that's not what we try to do. So this question of exempt versus non-exempt, I get this from supervisors a lot. I want to review this job description and I want this person to be, and they'll tell me which one they want it to be. And I have to come back and say, well, we don't just arbitrarily assign exempt or non-exempt classification to a position or a person, which is usually what they're asking. We have to look at why is something exempt or non-exempt, and it's based on federal law. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that's been around since 1930s, I think. It's based on an industrial model. It doesn't always fit very well in high-tech, higher ed, service industry, but that is the law of the land. And we do have to take seriously looking at each position and classifying it correctly, whether it's exempt or non-exempt. The law assumes that all positions are non-exempt unless you can prove otherwise, unless you can show an exemption, which is where the name comes from. And what are those exemptions? Well, there's basically 6 broad categories, and you can read them there, that the federal law allows to be used to decide if a person, or not a person, a position could be considered exempt, and it's exempt from those overtime laws. And so the one that primarily comes on our radar is that second one, administrative exemption. And so we will use the criteria. I'm not going to go into the details of that criteria just because of time, but you're welcome to ask. Sometimes supervisors will see me talk back to them an exemption worksheet that has the list of these criteria that says, let's talk about your position. And the duties, actual duties, not the title, not the person, but the duties, does it or does it not qualify for this administrative exemption or possibly a computer profession exemption? Every once in a while, a creative professional exemption as well. The executive exemptions are a little more obvious. If somebody's a director, a dean, a vice president, that's pretty obvious. But some of the others are a little bit more subtle, and particularly that second one. And so I might push back sometimes and say, let's talk about this. You might want them to go to be an exempt, and I might say, I'm not sure I'm seeing it in the duties of the position, so let's talk about it. Hope that makes some sense. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because it's federal law, and it matters because if we're to be found in violation of positions that are misclassified as exempt when they maybe should have been non-exempt, we can be fined. We could be investigated, we could be fined, and we could be paying some pretty serious money in lost overtime potential that should have been paid if somebody had been non-exempt and they had worked overtime. So yes, we do try and take it seriously and do it accurately. Do we get it exactly right? Might depend on who you ask and whether you've ever investigated to find out. Like a lot of areas of law, you don't know until you're sued, right? So let's talk about the second issue, which is our main topic for today, and that's setting the salaries. Some of this, it's going to be a little bit of a repeat. I'm just going to put it down on this personal level from some things Don has said. We do use these external benchmark positions to determine this market rate for all positions at SPU, with very few exceptions. Again, these benchmarks come from one or more salary surveys. Don has mentioned these at Coupa, the higher ed, which is nationwide. They come from the Milliman surveys, which is the Puget Sound area, and they come from this Hep B, which is the state of Washington positions. We're trying to move away from Hep B, but there are some that get used from that survey. The first two, Coupa and Milliman, we also participate. So every spring, HR is also submitting information to those surveys from our positions. So we get to participate both ways, providing information to them, and then of course we're one of those institutions that make up that whole survey that we then use internally on the back end. So you don't see all that behind the scenes, but that's part of what it means to participate with these surveys. Almost every position here at SPU has one. I think it's probably less than 10% don't have some kind of benchmark positions and are then just assigned to a salary range based on their duties. I didn't go into that, but say, well, how do you get assigned to a salary range if you don't have a benchmark? It's based on comparable duties to other positions here on campus. So if I'm looking at your position and I can't find good external benchmarks from one of these surveys, I will look at the duties of your job and try and find other positions that are similar on campus, and I'll assign you to that range, EO2 or NO9 or whatever it may be. And then your own personal goal will become what Don showed a few minutes ago, the average of all the other people that are in that range. Otherwise, your goal is going to be based on the benchmarks that get assigned to you, which is what we're trying to do for everybody. So here's a quick example, somewhat made up, but it's a fairly common position. In fact, there's another question on here. I'd like to know why some departments have administrative assistants and others have program coordinators. And so I just wanted to point out the idea of a program coordinator, administrative assistant. The title isn't necessarily the critical thing, it's the job duties. And so we'll be looking a lot more at what's in the job, not the title. And sometimes one may be more appropriate, or I might suggest a slight change. But here's an example, and these are actually two real benchmarks that are used for probably several program coordinator positions here on campus. The first one you see is at Milliman, PSR 1.03, Administrative Assistant 3. Well, the title of the benchmark is Administrative Assistant because you look at the duties that are in that benchmark and the duties that are in our job description for this position, and we say there's a large overlap there. But maybe it doesn't tell quite the whole story. So now I'm going to bring in a second position. This is going to be the Hep B 107N Program Coordinator. Well, different title, but you look at the duties. And between these two, in this particular example, this gives more than 80% overlap of what our position, our job description for this person is describing. And so we're going to say, okay, these two benchmarks are now applied to that position here at SPU and become the total. I'm not showing you the actual dollars, but we're going to average whatever the $2 are for those two positions, and that becomes the goal salary. So I hope that process makes some sense. We're taking these external benchmarks, maybe only one can tell the story for your position. Maybe it takes two, as in this example. There are sometimes we use three be able to say, okay, it takes 3 positions to tell at least 80% of the story for your position. And those 3 then are averaged, and that becomes essentially your personal goal salary for your position. And then you saw what happens to the goal salaries and whatnot with what Don showed a few minutes ago. Does that make sense? Any questions about this part? Because this is kind of where the rubber meets the road for your position and how it's benchmarked in the system.
So for an SP program coordinator, you would not just grab the program coordinator job and have that be the benchmark?
I might. It depends on the duties of that particular job.
And so you do it job by job?
We have a number of positions across campus that have program coordinator in the title.
Yes.
But they may be very different positions based on the duties. So I have to look at each one on its own merit, which is why this takes time, by the way. I don't just sort of slap a benchmark on it because it has a program coordinator title. So we'll look at that, and I could combine that program coordinator with some other, maybe with a accounting benchmark, because you got more duties along that line in your position. So each one is personalized, and no 2 are necessarily the same. There's no cookie cutter to this.
And in this example, there's nothing like that in Coupa. I mean, I'm surprised you're using Milliman and Headboard for that.
There could be. Maybe I should have pulled the Coupa example because we try to use Coupa more. That's a good point.
Yeah. Okay.
But Coupa has a lot more of their positions tend to be specific with higher ed, and so some that are broader based, we're going to look more to Milliman and even to Hep B.
Thanks.
When you're using those Coupa benchmarks, are you able to take a specific subset of those, such as private Christian institutions, or is it just all nationwide higher ed?
There is a sort we get on religious institutions. So we get a sort on religious institutions. So the categories we get Coupa would be private independent, private comprehensive, private religious for our size of institution. And right in the middle of that size range, you take the survey there and average all those tables and then increase it by 19% to get to the goal.
Could you hear that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I was going to add to Jackie, the other comments on Jackie's question. You know, occasionally supervisors are trying to achieve a certain salary and try to beef up the title, you know, like Dean of Custodial Services or something like that. And that doesn't work. And so watch out for title inflation because it's going to be looked at in terms of the actual job description.
And there are times when a title is suggested that I don't think is appropriate. Maybe they're a manager and they're not managing a program or a person, and so I say that's probably not a manager position. Maybe we should use coordinator. And so we'll have that discussion. And any supervisor that's dealt with HR understands that we do have a discussion about this. It's usually by email, but we'll do draft information, we'll talk about it. You know the position better than I do. I'm trying to apply the benchmarks and understand your position, so it becomes a conversation, and that's how we work on these things. Any other questions on this?
Just kind of a side note, it seems like there's a lot of variance in the quality of our supervisors, and so I think, you know, some staff can go to their supervisor and they will advocate for them, and then others might not. So I think that's where some of the frustration might come from for some people, that it's not consistent that the person above us will advocate for us with HR.
But it doesn't hurt to ask, and we will be working on further supervisor training technique, and hope will help that. So, but fair question. Yeah.
Do we have the ability to see the tools you're using to benchmark people if we want to appeal having been benchmarked? Or
You can talk to your supervisor. First of all, starting with your job description itself. You know, do you guys even have an updated one? I think you ought to be discussing your job description every year with your supervisor, because it ought to be part of your evaluation, because things change. So your job description itself is something you should look at every year. You can certainly ask your supervisor then to say, how am I benchmarked? What does that look like? And ask the questions from there. So yes, I think you should. Now, again, do it nicely. Okay.
Speaking of evaluations, is there a process that we should be going through every year for those? A standard university process?
Okay, I'm going to defer somewhat, say that's not our topic for today, but fair question. And no, there's not a standard university process. There are some forms that are available to be used on the HR website. Over the years, the process has been fairly decentralized by kind of VP area and department. I would personally like to see that change, and I've got some proposals I'm going to be giving the senior leadership team probably over the summer to see if we can move towards something that's a little more consistent and a little bit more appropriate and aggressive across campus. Because I think anybody would like to feel like they know where they stand, and that's a fair question. So, yes.
Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about timing. If we have to start all the way from reevaluating our job description, and we're going into a new fiscal year in 6 weeks, what's the timing of all this?
Okay, fair question. We go through an annual salary planning process every year that you may or may not be directly aware of, which starts back in February when I send out notices to VPs and deans and directors to say we're starting, and ask them to start looking at the process from their side. And that is, do they have positions that they think need to be reclassified? And maybe they need to revisit the job description, and we do classification reviews. And so we have a period over the spring, all of which culminates in what's going on right now, which is the salary planning templates that Don was showing you pieces of that are going back out to the VPs for some final adjustments that will determine the salary letters that you guys receive at the end of June. That's the normal process. Now, you're asking something slightly different, is where do you start if you've got a question? Let me say that you don't have to depend on that process, and salaries and classification reviews happen all year round. They can happen at any point. That's just a focused time that we do in the spring, because we know that the VPs and directors and deans need to be given a particular timing to make sure that the salary letters that go out in June are as accurate as they know how to make them. But that doesn't mean that in July or August or September, you can't ask the question and say, I'd like to look at my job description, and perhaps it will lead to us doing the classification review on you in October. And so something could change for you at any time of year. So we have both. We have a system-wide approach to it in the spring, but there's also individuals can happen any time during the year. Am I answering what you're asking?
Yeah, but aren't we also then subject to the budget constraints?
We're always.
Yeah, we're always subject to budget constraints. So even if, for instance, we had a position that was reclassified, and maybe it's the job has evolved, it's grown, it's now a bigger job, and we have a job description redone, and we do a classification review, and you now have a higher benchmark, a new goal salary. The actual salary is a separate process, and that is subject to the specific budget and approval of the supervisor and in the VP area. So we may have a movement towards improvement, but the actual salary is definitely subject to budget.
Okay, but don't you then need to be in coordination with the budget planning and any budget increases that are planned for the next fiscal year? I mean, we're talking about a difference between changing your classification and what your actual salary is, but then are we not really expected to change our salary if it's indicated in the changing classification until the new fiscal year?
No, something could change at any time in the year, again, subject to budget. So if your position warrants an increase of some sort, and within your director or VP area, they have an ability in the budget to make a change during the year, yes, that could still happen. Now, obviously, that's a little rarer because budgets tend to be fairly well set ahead of time. Finance office and Chris Cope and whatnot are integrally involved in this process as well, approving or not approving whether there actually is a budget for something to change. So that part cannot be missed, so that's a good question.
I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions on things that we can do to sort of advocate for ourselves. If a lot of what improvements might be made are dependent on our supervisors, it sounds like that's who we would go to first, is review our job description and these things with our supervisor. But is there anything that we can do directly and personally to advocate for ourselves?
Well, I think that is what you would do.
But I'm, like Elizabeth brought up, the quality of our supervisors is so different, and with training eventually happening at some point, and whether they take that to heart or not, dependent on a lot of things. Is there anything that we can do to advocate for ourselves, whether it's working with HR directly, or just being our own advocates?
Right. Well, I would always start with your supervisor, but I hear what you're saying. And if you feel like you're not being heard, or feel like you just have additional questions, in addition to starting with the supervisor, you can always approach HR. That would be a fair question. Okay, let me move on just a little bit. About the salary range question, because that has come up. I'm in a certain salary range, and I noticed this year my salary range went down. I heard about it. We used to put those on the letters, and we took them off, particularly because it didn't really matter, as Don mentioned a few minutes ago, what your salary range is. Your goal salary is the really important part. What is your goal salary, and where are you compared to your goal? And that is something we are going to put back in the letters this year. Don mentioned again that your benchmarks determine your goal salary, and your actual salary is normally between 80 and 120%. And most new employees will tend to start a little bit below the goal, so closer to the 80, 85, and work up. The idea is to work up towards that goal salary. Some people will actually be above their goal salary. We also mentioned that if you don't have those external benchmarks, then we'll assign one. We had a question on here. Okay, I've already addressed it. If SPU used to provide classification salary range in our percent of goal in our salary letters each year, but stopped doing that, why was this decision made to keep this information from staff? Deep dark secret. It was made because what we're trying to say here, the actual salary range, if you're in N09 or EO2, is not really all that important for determining your salary unless you don't have any benchmarks, and that's fairly rare. What actually matters is your goal salary and how far you are from goal, as Don was showing earlier. So to put that salary range, you're in N09 on your salary letter, kind of meaningless, and it actually was distracting and causing more questions than it was worth. What we're going to do is put back in what is meaningful, which is your how far are you from goal. You're at 85%, you're at 94%, you're at 100% of goal. And that's probably a lot more helpful piece of information, so that's going to be worked back in this year. And here's the chart Don was referencing earlier. If you look at that solid black line in the middle there, let's see if I can do this right here. That's your 100%. These are average goal salaries of positions across campus, and this was done back last summer. And you'll notice that down here you've got some people that are down. Here's your 80%, and here's your 120%. So there's your range right there of any given position. And you'll see down here there are going to be a very few positions, not very many at all, that are actually below that 80%. So it's rare, and it gets addressed fairly quickly. So we're going to be bringing people up into the 80 to 120% range. You'll also see very, very few up here that are going to be above the 120%. That's also very rare. Most people are going to be within that range, and the average is for across campus for staff is at that 94%. Again, that was as of last year. That's as of the aggregate goal salaries and the aggregate numbers from last summer. That will change year to year, but that's where we were. So the idea is that we're not at 80% as a group. We're closer to that 94%. Any questions on that?
Can I ask a question about the letter itself?
Okay.
Right now we get our letters July 1, because that's when the new fiscal year starts. Is it possible to get them June 1? No faculty get theirs. I mean, theirs is a contract, so I understand it's different. But I'm wondering if we can get it before the new fiscal year starts.
Based on our current timing, remember I said we start back in February and March with the classification review process, and we work through budgeting as well as classifications. There's a two-step process of sending raw data out to the VP areas and bringing it back to verify certain information, and then another process of sending templates out for actual salaries. All of that process takes an enormous amount of time to try and allow time. And so to do, we'd have to start way earlier than that.
Yeah, probably the biggest hurdle to that is administrator time to be able to get that done before board meeting. We had in the board meetings in mid-May, and probably from mid-April to mid-May, you're gearing up and preparing for that. So there's some things that we're doing already on the side, but the biggest challenge to get to a June 1 date would be just administrator time.
It's a fair question. Maybe we could look at it to see if there are some ways to adjust it a little bit. But The difference on faculty, I mean, faculty contracts go out in April. They're on a whole different cycle process, so there's no way to compare those two. So.
Eric, before you switch slides,
Oh,
I'm trying to figure out what the numbers along the bottom are.
Those are actually individual employees. So there's 300 and something of them down there that are in this actual chart, and it's showing where their particular goal salary is. So you're looking at literally points of reference for every person.
That seems to me that, so you have 313 staff total, because you don't have 313, you don't have 313 total employees. This seems to indicate you have 313 people above.
These are all 313 full-time staff, so it excludes all the part-time staff, just for ease.
Okay, so you have a total of 313 full-time staff.
They were used in this example, yes.
So you're just numbering them along that bottom.
Correct,
axis.
correct. So literally every person along that bottom is a data point on the chart.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, thank you. Question, thank you.
I have a question about benchmarks. I think that my position is unique here. And so is it my responsibility to figure out with my supervisor what the benchmarks are, since there is no other position on campus that does what I do? Or is that the supervisor's responsibility? Is that something that I come to HR to work with?
You would start by talking to your supervisor about your job description and the question about, do you have appropriate benchmarks? The supervisor would work with me, with HR, to try and figure out what is appropriate, or if we cannot find any, then what's an appropriate existing salary range to put your position into, and that becomes your sort of internal benchmark then. So yeah, if you have a question about that, start with your supervisor.
Right. But again, how do I advocate for myself? Starting with my supervisor, but it's sort of an anomaly. I don't know.
If you want to talk to me afterwards a little more specifically, I'm happy to help figure that out. Okay, I want to watch our time.
I mean, one of the responses is be aware of what your position is in other places.
I know.
And so, I mean, that's, if I was in a position that I thought I wasn't recognized the way it should be, whatever factors I want to rank, I'd say, okay, my position at XYZ institution is this. So what are the differences there? That'd be a starting point.
No,
I mean, over time, we've had supervisors come that want to use their own special table, okay, to benchmark their particular staff. And we look at it and we said, you know, that may be helpful in some circumstances, but we also have this thing of, as Dave mentioned, fairness throughout the institution. And at least with the past presidents I've worked for, there has been a desire. We've tried to avoid the situations where you have outliers. A typical example, if you look at the Chronicle of Higher Education in any year, the salary survey, who's the highest paid people in higher ed? Coaches. Much higher than presidents. And then you can go to other places and see medical doctors and medical staff. You can go back to some of the Ivy Leagues and they'll have deans of schools of business higher than a president. I mean, we've said we want to have some type of fairness, whatever that is, in our system. So there's been a desire to keep everybody, and that's why I mentioned earlier, even the president is tied to the system with the board. But in terms of advocacy, I could just tell you what I would do. I make my case by bringing out examples of what some of the positions other places.
Correct. I've done that.
Okay, I want to watch our time because we're just about out of it. I just wanted to briefly remind you of some of the other things besides salary that are part of the compensation system here at SPU and that are provided to you and for you as employees. Something you might not think about, much like the FICA, which is, you know, half of it you pay as a deduction on your paycheck if you look. The other half is paid by the school. That covers your Social Security and Medicare. Obviously, you know that as an employee, you're getting covered with medical, dental, vision. You know, if you want to choose the PPO plan, you have a little bit of cost. If you want to add dependents, you have some costs. If you're on the high deductible plan, there's contributions nearly covering the deductible through your HSA. Life insurance is provided to all employees up for 2 times your annual salary if you're qualified. Short-term disability, long-term disability. We're self-insured, self-administered on short-term disability, but we have an insurance plan that's provided for you by the school for long-term disability. Workers' compensation, your sick and vacation allowance, you can see the list there. So that was just a quick reminder that when you talk about the high percentage of our total budget here at SBU that goes to salaries and compensation, you know, between 35 and 47%, depending on whether you're exempt or non-exempt, is the fringe rate benefit that's charged to department budgets for each person on top of salaries. So you can see that's a sizable amount of money that gets put into the salary and compensation budgets combined. Quick reminder, today's Friday, and open enrollment goes for one more week. Oh, you have a question?
I just have one question, or maybe if there's a way to find this out, but my impression is that pretty much all institutions or companies have a lot of benefits, like very appreciative of all these benefits, but that most of them have like 401ks and life insurance and stuff like that. So I don't really know what to do with that, but I know that like if there's ways that we can compare to know on top of salary what this is valued at, if that makes any sense.
The simplest way is to look at your paycheck stub. You guys ever do that? Ever go online on Banner and look at your paycheck stub every month? There's a column there for the current month. There's another column for year to date. And each side has what is deducted from your payroll and what is paid by the school on both sides. So you can look at a year to date and just add them up for both of you. And that's for, at least for understanding the value or the cost of this. Now, how do you compare it to anybody else? Would have to do some other research and find a frame that works there, I guess.
Okay, thanks, that's helpful.
Just two real quick questions. The first one, what is SPU doing in terms of thinking ahead long-term, the implications of the 15 minimum wage that might happen, and how might that impact kind of the overall budget and salaries for everything else? And then just kind of another little question, like as the university has surpluses during certain academic years or fiscal years or whatever, has there been any thought about providing some sort of bonus or something to employees with that funding?
Well, I'll answer the first one. Don can answer the second. Okay. $15 an hour, we've done at least a preliminary look at our current employees, and we have very, very few people that aren't already paid more than that. Now, if they start to include student workers in that definition, then we'd have a problem. And that'll be something else we have to discuss, and that's something we obviously would oppose. But for actual employees here on campus, I can't remember when the last time we looked at this was, but we have very few people that are paid less than $15 an hour to start with.
Well, it's roughly $30,000 a year, probably $31,000 on a salary basis, the 15. So about 6 years ago, we started worrying about staff that were below 30,000. We tried to get, I think, all but a very small number are above 30,000 in the institution. That's one factor. This past year, I asked Gary to look at the cost of living in Seattle for apartments and food and transportation to make sure we're monitoring that it's a livable wage in terms of where the costs are going. And so we try to keep an eye on that and what the minimums will be. The last question was, escape me.
Well, yeah.
Oh, yours is surplus.
Yeah.
The year we had, I mentioned a couple times, the year we had a 0% increase because of budget planning and trying to hold it on enrollment. When we beat the enrollment goal that year, we turned around and gave a 2% increase to all faculty and staff at December. So we said, let's all work together to try to keep students and retain them. This is during the 2008-9 period, and everybody was worried about the future of the economy. And we pulled together and we said, we better not raise salaries this year. Let's keep students enrolled. And when we did a better job than we anticipated, we distributed bonus. So that happens from time to time. But those are one-time type of bonuses as opposed to being in your base salary in the future. The use of surpluses at the end of the year, almost always because they're temporary. When we say that, they're one-time money, they're not repetitive. is we invest those in capital improvements. So what you're seeing around campus this summer with Alexander, or this year at Alexander, you'll see lights going up on our Wallace Field. You'll see a variety of things happening on campus. That's the primary use of surplus.
Hey, I really need to cut this short. We only have 3 minutes left. Gary, were you going to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about training?
let me introduce a topic that we obviously don't have time to talk about, but I want to pique your curiosity just a little bit. Because our second topic today was going to be in the area of staff development and training. So I think perhaps we'll have maybe some further forum time in the future. You're already aware that we do some real basic training, because when you were hired on, you had to go through preventing discrimination, harassment, FERPA, those kinds of things. We've already signed the contract, and we're currently in the process of implementation with a group called Skillsoft, which is going to bring us a much more robust and healthy online training opportunities in a whole variety of areas. So here's the screen I'm working with right now that we're working through some implementation factors. We're going to be providing, and we're going to roll these out in segments, things in the business skills courseware, things in desktop skills, such as Microsoft Office Suite, Adobe Acrobat, and more. Things that you can train on from your desktop that will help you do your job better. Things in legal compliance, of course. And a lot of this will be for supervisor training, but some of these will be available for others. HIPAA, for instance, but wage and hour. We talked about exempt, non-exempt, overtime, those kind of questions. Supervisors need this for training. Title IX, Title VII, environmental health and safety. And then this will allow us to do special groupings for people that are in, again, groupings like supervisors, or groupings like your department, or people that are non-exempt or exempt, or there could be a whole variety of ways we can group and package some training opportunities for you. It also allows us to do some instructor-led training, which we need to do more of here on campus, but this is how you would enroll for it. Enroll for the class, waitlist it, get your certification that you completed it, and have it become part of your, as it were, permanent record. There will also be ways for supervisors to work with you on your annual performance plan to say, how can we work together to help you in your personal, professional development? So more on that when we have more time. It's not live yet. We're hoping to roll out the first stages of it by later this summer, which I say right there. Okay? So thank you for allowing us to be here today.